I rise to speak on behalf of the Greens on the Modern Slavery Bill 2018 and give the Greens support for this bill. As my Greens colleague in the other place, Maureen Faruqi, said when talking on this bill, out of sight, out of mind is not good enough. And let us be all clear, she said, let us all be clear that enslaving people, abusing them, exploiting them and depriving someone of their freedom and liberty are the most atrocious of crimes. It is absolutely clear that there are things that we can do locally to impact on global issues, and the Greens will support any legislation that comes to this House that looks to enshrine the protection of human rights, the protection of people's rights into our legislation. And this is one of those bills that looks to recognise the global problems that we face but acts locally in relation to the protection of human rights. It is clear that when you look at the submissions that were made by the Human Rights Law Centre and Amnesty International and others on the issue of modern slavery, and they were particularly making submissions in this case to the federal parliamentary inquiry, that the issue of modern slavery is something that as a human rights organisations and as people committed to human rights we need to be doing more to address. Modern slavery, as defined in the Human Rights Law Centre submission, is a common umbrella term used to describe a range of extreme labour rights abuses encompassing slavery, servitude, human trafficking and forced or compulsory labour. These distinct violations are defined in a variety of international law instruments as follows. Slavery is defined under the United Nations Slavery Convention 1926 as the status or condition of a person over whom any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership are excused. Forced labour is defined under the ILO Forced Labour Convention number 29, 1930 as all work or service which is extracted from any person under the threat of a penalty and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. And human trafficking is defined under the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress and Punish Trafficking Transnational Organised Crime 2000 as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring or receipt of persons by means of the treat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or of a position or vulnerability or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Those are the international definitions that drive the international law instruments that drive the definitions of modern slavery. But the reality of what we are talking about when we talk about modern slavery is much more personal, much more confronting than that. At the recent May Day March and Family Day in Sydney, there was a woman who spoke on behalf of Asian women workers in New South Wales, and one of the stories that she told is something that I can never get out of my mind when it comes to the unintended consequences of our consumerist society and what that has on the idea of people's treatment in the workplace, our commitment to the idea, well, not my personal commitment, but a general commitment to the idea of putting profits ahead of people, of looking at the idea of maximising dollars. The story was told of a woman who regularly suffered from urinary tract infections because she worked at a nail salon, somewhere in Sydney this was, and she was not allowed to take breaks. She was not allowed to take breaks to go to the toilet. Now, that is something that is just so unbelievably... I used to work for Amnesty International. The amount of human rights violations that I sadly saw around the world while I did that job, when I saw those things appear in the videos and the footage, is just extreme. But when you hear about those stories happening right now in Sydney, in a nail salon that quite possibly somebody that works in this place went into, you start having to look at what does this mean for the reality of the kind of community that we look in. And while we look at the idea of this modern slavery bill today and providing protection, there is obviously a lot more that we can do to protect workers' rights in this state, to enshrine human rights protections beyond just looking at this bill, and I look forward to the idea of talking with everyone around how we can enshrine more human rights protections into legislation in New South Wales to provide protections. The other element that I wanted to touch on is a commitment that I have to start supporting and being supportive of the question that is asked and posed every year in Fashion Revolution Week about who made your clothes. It's a genuine ask. It was one of the first acts that I did when I was elected to Parliament, was ran downstairs with my dress inside out and took a photo on the steps of the New South Wales Parliament to show my tag, because part of the campaign is to wear your clothes inside out on the day, to show that you know who made your clothes, where they were made, and that you know that that supply chain, the clothes that you were wearing, where they came from and what they do. Now that is an incredible campaign. I spoke at a beautiful Fashion Revolution event that was with local designers and makers and producers in the electorate of Newtown just in April. And at that forum we heard the most amazing stories. The most amazing stories of the fact that, did you know that actually we have lost the ability in this state and in this country to produce stockings. Now, if we're talking about the idea of wanting to boost employment and trade and get people to shop locally, we need to be looking about how we're actually skilling up people to make buttonholes, to be able to do the kind of knitting of cotton and wool and natural fibres that now we're losing as skills, as crafts in our society. Now, these are things that allow us to encourage local jobs. It allows us to look at the environmental impact of the idea of getting things from offshore, but it also allows us to maintain crafts and connection with knowing where our clothes were made, but also making sure that we can understand what that is and how that is done, and that people are protected with the rights that we want to see when they are engaging with that. Now, those are just two small examples as to the kind of impacts and the kinds of changes that we can make. But I think it's also important to recognise that this bill will provide a connection to what is a global movement. And if we saw jurisdictions around the world at a state and national level passing this kind of legislation, then over time we would see that global slave trade removed. And that is something that we should be working towards and committed to. It's not just okay to protect those and the rights of those workers here in this country. We must be talking about a global movement that protects the rights of women, of children, of workers around the globe. I wanted to say that I'm very pleased and acknowledge the fact that the amendments moved by my Greens colleague in the other place, David Shoebridge, in relation to the concerns around organ trafficking remain in the bill. I acknowledge that the impact of these amendments is going to be that the Commissioner would monitor and collaborate on suspected instances of trading in tissue in New South Wales, and the Commissioner could provide reports on the tissue, public education and awareness campaigns, and there could be greater certainty that organ trading is not involved in supply chains. And the amendment also would mean that the extraterritorial application of modern slavery offences under Section 4 would apply to trading in tissue by any residents of New South Wales who might buy or deal in human organs overseas. It is welcome that that amendment remains in the bill. I wish to foreshadow that I do intend to move one amendment on behalf of the Greens here in this chamber in relation particularly to concerns raised by Scarlet Alliance and others that are advocates of the protection of the rights of sex workers, and making sure that we do not unintendedly have this bill being a way to target sex workers or cause concern to them as a result of what is being passed here, which is about protection of women's rights and of rights of people that are at risk of modern slavery. The amendments, which I'll speak to very briefly as they are done, basically look at the idea of not allowing this bill to be used in any way to target consenting adult sex workers, and I think it's important to clarify that and put that on the record. I appreciate that that is not the intention of those that have introduced the bill, but I think it is very important to reassure that community that is so often scapegoated and marginalised, that that is not the intention, and our commitment here today or tonight is actually to be providing additional protections for people, for their rights, and that includes the rights of people working as adults in consensual sex work arrangements. So I foreshadow that I will be moving that amendment in this place. The Greens support any legislation, as I said, that support the enshrining of human rights protections in New South Wales, and I commend the bill to the House.